Make It Right, the manufacturing podcast.
There are hundreds of thousands of privately owned manufacturing companies in the United States alone, providing services to a vast array of customers. Many of these companies are family-owned or partnership businesses, and eventually leadership must transition to the next generation, to new owners or new management. We all know change is difficult and often avoided for as long as possible. But with so many people, employees, their families, suppliers, and customers relying on that business, it's important to make sure that the owner and leader transition is done smoothly and effectively. This week on the Make It Right podcast, we're going to look at how to set up your company to successfully transition. In other words, how to be transition ready, because you never know when it's going to come. My guest is Patrick Bradley, who's been working with clients as a life insurance and financial advisor specialist for more than 3 decades, and he has helped companies make that transition. He's now focusing exclusively on the manufacturing sector with his company, Manufactured Financial Solutions. Patrick, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining me.
Janet, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to share some information and hopefully it's helpful to your audience.
Yeah, I think it probably is going to be. So you've been helping clients with their personal and business planning for a number of years, providing life insurance and financial advisory services. So people are pretty much aware of what that could be. Why did you recently decide to actually focus your business exclusively on the manufacturing sector?
A good question. Well, first, let me say I have a tremendous amount of respect for all business owners. So their creativity, their entrepreneurship, their commitment to their industry and their company and employees and the communities that they call home. But when it comes to manufacturing, it reminds me of a quote from an 18th century economist. And he said, "The entrepreneur shifts economic resources out of an area of lower into an area of higher productivity and greater yield." And every time I read that quote, I think that economist was thinking about the manufacturing owner. And I've had 2 early experiences in my career. The first is I'm sitting in the office of a manufacturing company owner, and there were multiple 2-ton presses banging out metal brackets for Harley Davidson motorcycles and a furniture brand. And the tempo or the orchestra of these presses and the hum of the factory floor was just music to my ears. And that's why I really enjoy going to my customers, because I enjoy the manufacturing environment. And another experience that I had early in my career was a manufacturing company made quite large machines, and you could literally eat your lunch off the factory floor. And I was just really impressed with this business. They're still a client today, where a raw material starts on one end and a finished product comes out on the other end. And the processes and the gyrations that the raw material has to go through to end up as a finished product, that whole process just amazes me.
It's kind of like magic, isn't it?
Sometimes it is like magic. Yes, it is.
Yeah. So when you look at manufacturing companies and you said, you're focusing business exclusively on those companies right now, what are some of the challenges that you see with those businesses when it comes to this transition ready situation?
Well, like your friend Kevin Snook says in his book, Make It Right, there is no surprise that the role of the manufacturing CEO is considered to be one of the most challenging jobs. When you step back and you think about it, the manufacturing leaders, they need to be focused on their customers, their upstream and downstream relationship management, rapid changes in technology, competition, their product and service mix, talent management, profitability. That's just an awful lot to be thinking about. And then when it comes to their own personal financial management and their non-operating business planning, managing buy-sell agreements and the business continuity and unlocking illiquid private company wealth and risk management, it's the rare individual that can really get their arms around all of that and successfully pull it off. Mm-hmm. So that's one big challenge. They're busy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's not their area of specialty, right? So when you start to dig into something like that, it probably is quite confusing. And so you kind of say, "Oh, I don't have time for this. There's a issue on the factory floor I got to run." And so stuff gets probably pushed to the side for a very long time until it's like we need this stuff now, right?
Well, absolutely. And, to be fair, this whole process, it's difficult and it's
Mhm.
complex and it's not in their wheelhouse. They know how to make something. They know how to make something happen. But when it comes to the planning and, family dynamics, um, and many times it's just not a high priority to them.
Yeah, yeah. So how do most companies do a transition to new owners?
Well, most don't.
Oh.
The well, the survival. No, I don't mean all don't. I mean most,
Mhm.
majority don't. The survival rate is quite low. I should have looked up the stats, but in the family business arena, the probability of a company making it to the third generation is very, very small.
Is
I
that
happen to
right?
be working with a Oh, absolutely. I
Wow.
happen to be working with a fifth generation family. Well, I should say the fifth generation is being groomed now for leadership and ownership. And I did the math. If you started with 1,000 companies and you factored in the probability of how many were going to make it to the second generation, third generation, fourth generation, and to the fifth, out of 1,000 companies, there are roughly four left.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So, and there's a big disconnect when it comes to all of this transition planning. We need to keep in mind 100% of current ownership is going to leave their company someday, either voluntarily or involuntarily.
Mhm.
And most business owners believe that their exit is going to be the result of some planning and action that they implement. I mean, like when I say most, I mean roughly 80%. And almost as many of those have yet to train or hire their next generation of owners and leaders.
Mhm.
And most have simply not identified the steps necessary to exit their businesses successfully.
Right. So I'm sure the light bulb has gone on for a lot of people who are listening right now. And, they've talked about their exit strategy and they've thought about it, but they haven't really done anything about it. So, what are some of the typical questions a business owner or the owners should be asking themselves when they start to consider how they want to make that transition play out?
That's an excellent question. So I have three responses to it. The first is talking as a business owner, where do I want to be? And the second question is, where am I now?
Hmm.
And the third is, who can help me close the gap? Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So, where do I want to be? Do I want to sell my company to family members or transition it to family members? Do I want to sell it to current management or employees? Or do I want to set up my company for a sale to a third party? So let's say it's to a third party. Okay, so we want to sell to a third party when? Is that in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? And put a put a date on it, and then take a look at where are you now. If you were an outside investor looking at purchasing your company, what are some areas of your company that you might need to tidy up a little bit to make it more attractive to that outside investor? And then the third is, who can help me close the gap? There are there's kind of a cottage industry out there of people, and I'll throw myself in there, that have an interest in helping companies succeed. And it's specialized work, and it's work that needs to be done.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
there are a lot of questions that the business owner should be asking them. But I think if they answer those first three, where do I want to be? where am I now, and who can help me close the gap?
Yeah, and I think probably there's a lot of business owners that just assume somebody's going to come along and want to buy their business. But you're right. You have to look at your business and know if it's something that somebody else is going to want to buy, and look down the road at who might be some of your target purchasers. So there's a lot of things to think about. So one of the areas that you've talked about is that there's that can cause a lot of undue trouble is that buy-sell agreement. So if you've actually got your ducks in a row and gotten to a certain point where you've got a buy-sell agreement, I mean, how do you design that to make that transition smooth?
Well, the best would be to probably start 5 to 10 years prior to when you want to make that transition.
Wow.
And then when it comes to, and by the way, there's just too many business owners that think they're going to pay attention to what they need to do to transition their business when they're ready to transition. Well, if you're really looking your business when you want, for the money you want, and to the people you want, that takes planning, and that doesn't happen overnight. So, and when you asked about the buy-sell agreement,
Mm-hmm.
What I've come to appreciate is that a well-drafted buy-sell agreement, and by the way, for some of your listeners, sometimes these are called shareholder agreements, sometimes they're called business continuity agreements, but a well-crafted buy-sell agreement provides an objective means of transferring ownership under difficult circumstances, as well as protecting all parties when certain trigger events occur. And by trigger events, I mean dying, disability, divorce, quit, getting fired, retired. So a good buy-sell agreement is going to address those trigger events and more, so that when that trigger event happens, everybody knows what needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen some real life scenarios where the buy-sell agreement went wrong? Like, can you give us some? I think probably what we need is a horror story. So if you have something that you can tell, like this is the kind of thing that you can get yourself into if you don't have these things sorted out properly.
Well, sure. One would be addressing the specific trigger event. Most buy-sell agreements out there address what happens if a shareholder dies. Very few address what happens when a shareholder wants to retire or gets fired. So one thing is to make sure that the trigger event is addressed. And the other is, how do you value the company? Is that based on a formula? Is that based on a fixed price? So here's one example of where this can cause some trouble. So let's say you and our mutual friend Bob are 50-50 owners in a company that you started, say, half a dozen years ago. And at the time you started it, you had a buy-sell agreement drafted, and the two of you agreed that your company was worth $1 million. And now let's fast forward 6 years later, and now your company's worth, say, $5 million. And Bob dies. So let's go back to the agreement. What does that buy-sell agreement say that the company was worth? It says it's worth $1 million. Well, now, Bob's spouse is not going to be too happy knowing that there's a legal agreement sitting out there that states the value of the company is $1 million, when there's been an awful lot of pillow talk from Bob and his wife about this company being worth somewhere in the range of $5 million. So there's a big disparity there. And, that can be settled in the courtroom, and it can be all drawn out. And at the end of the day, not too many people are going to be really, really happy.
You're listening to the Make It Right podcast, and my guest has been Patrick Bradley, the personal and business planning advisor at Manufactured Financial Solutions. For 30 years, he's been helping companies successfully transition to new owners, the next generation, or new management. This is a process that, if not done right, can lead to all kinds of complications and can destroy families, friendships, or the business itself. It's also a process that often gets neglected. I hope you'll join us next week on the Make It Right podcast when Patrick explains how to structure a life insurance policy so that it complements the buy, sell, or shareholder agreement. It's easy to get this wrong, and it can be a very costly mistake. I'm Janet Eastman. I hope you'll follow us for other manufacturing news on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and subscribe to the podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or YouTube. Thanks very much for listening to the Make It Right podcast.